Hello and welcome to Suzi's Book Bag, hosted by me, Suzi Feay. Today's tote bag is from the imprint Michael Joseph, and as you can see, their colophon is a kind of non-binary mer person. I've picked that because today's guest, as anyone who follows him on social will know, loves to be by the seaside. You'll also know that he loves spreading out those bare legs of his next to the nearest groin. And I'm referring to the Coastal Defence Against Erosion, of course. It's Paul Burston, the journalist, novelist, activist, podcaster, creator of the Polari literary salon and founder of 3 literary prizes, and now memoirist. He's a very busy person, so I'm extremely thrilled that he has consented to join me in the book bag. Welcome, Paul.
Hello, Suzi. Thanks for having me.
So, you are up to an awful lot of things. You have been so incredibly busy. I thought actually we might take a bit of a trip down memory lane. And let's go back to when we first met. We were both at Time Out together all those years ago. And can you believe it was so long ago that I think you were editor of just the lesbian and gay section? I don't think it was a long string of initials in those days, was it?
It was just the gay section.
Oh, God.
I campaigned to change it to lesbian and gay, and they agreed to change it to gay and lesbian because they wanted the G to come first because of the alphabetical order of the sections. They wanted it to come after film and cabaret.
Yeah.
But I insisted that it have lesbian in it because gay was just too male only. So, and then slowly we evolved and it became the LGBT section by the time I left, which was in 2013. So I was there for 20 years.
Wow.
Long time.
I remember you took over from a chap called Michael Griffiths, who everybody completely adored. And he simply could not be critical when doing reviews. And I was on the subs section, and we had a kind of joke that a typical Michael Griffiths review would go something like, an unmissable tour de force which simply cries out to be seen. He was just so enthusiastic about everything. But you were a kind of different gay editor.
Well, I mean, I started writing journalism in the late 80s. I'd been an activist with ACT UP and with Outrage. I was, bearing in mind, this was at a time when people were still dying of AIDS, regularly, as indeed Michael did. And the situation for gay and lesbian people, for gay men in particular, we had an unequal age of consent at 21 still. We had no employment rights, no partnership rights. I knew people who died and their partner was ejected from their home by their parents because they had no partnership rights to stay. And it felt to me that the sort of happy, clappy gay journalism of the time wasn't really what was called for. I wrote several times and got into trouble for saying that the gay press didn't want journalists, they wanted cheerleaders. And I wasn't a cheerleader. I believe that you get the culture you deserve and you have to critique it. No other section editor of Time Out would be expected to love every single film, play or book that they saw. Why should I? But that at the time was actually quite extraordinary. And I got into a lot of rows with people because the gay press, especially the free gay press, relies heavily on advertising. And in return for that, people get very, very fluffy, friendly editorial. It's advertorial, really. And I was working for a magazine where I had a platform where I didn't have to rely on that because it was a mainstream magazine. At the time, I think I was the only journalist writing as a gay columnist in a mainstream publication in the UK at that time. And that responsibility weighed heavily. And I mean, Dominic Wells, who was the editor, said afterwards that he hired me to be a troublemaker. And my brief was to cause trouble. I remember about 3 weeks into my job, I bumped into Tony Elliott, the publisher, in reception, and he said, I see you've been lighting fires everywhere. I didn't say anything. And I thought, oh my God, is he angry with me? And he gave it a pause. Then he said, well done, keep it up. And so I knew I was in the right place for me. But it was a lonely path to tread at the time. There weren't that many journalists out there who were being critical in the way that I was about some of the shortcomings of our culture and some of the things that weren't said. You know, the gay press at the time tended to focus a lot on homophobia, which of course it should do, but it very, very rarely commented on the things that were kind of the secrets within our community, the problems within our community. There was a lot of you know, anti-femme sentiment. There was a lot of body fascism. There was a lot of substance abuse and alcohol abuse, which I also was responsible for my own path in that respect. But there were very few people writing about, you know, the truth as I saw it anyway. I mean, you can only write about the truth as you see it. It's just your opinion. I mean, because I was in that rare position, whenever there was a gay news story, I would get phone calls from well-meaning straight journalists in the mainstream media or the television or radio asking me, what does the gay community think about this? And I'd say, I'll just open the window and ask them for you. You know, think of the life of Brian, you know. I mean, I can't speak. We don't speak as one voice, you know. I only speak for myself, but I do claim the right to speak. And that ruffled a few feathers.
Well, the other thing is that among anyone, you were out and about within the gay community, socializing, networking, really finding out what was going on. I mean, you were phenomenally well connected and remain so.
Well, that was part of my job, you know. I mean, I think because I came from an activist background, I probably approached journalism in a different way to the way I would have done had I become a journalist when I was 16. Because when I was 16 at school, I actually applied for a job in the local newspaper and I got turned down. So I did A-levels and ended up in university. Came out of university, became friends with a guy called Vaughan Williams, who I shared a flat with. Went back to university to do an MA in film and drama. And Vaughan was a political activist, but in a cabaret troupe. So he sort of took messages through cabaret into schools and colleges. And Section 28 came along, which was a huge, you know, shock to everyone at the time. And it really galvanized a whole generation of LGBT people. And I became very politicized. And then Vaughan got sick with HIV and AIDS, and he died. And I threw myself into ACT UP. And while I was in ACT UP, I lost so many friends over that about 4 or 5 years I was in ACT UP. So many people I knew and loved died. And I came out of that a changed person. And when I became a journalist, I knew that I had to use that journalism as a platform to talk about the issues that concern me, as well as writing about, you know, film and television and books and all the rest of it. The Time Out Gay section was quite odd because it kind of overlapped with so many other sections, because I didn't just write about clubs and bars, I wrote about culture. So there was often territorial discussions between editors, shall we say, about who was going to get to cover this, this and this. I feel bad sort of speaking badly of Michael, because he was a lovely, lovely man, but he wasn't really meant to be a journalist. You know, he was a cheerleader, and that was his. He was on that generation as well, where there weren't that many platforms for gay, queer, whatever you want to call it, platforms in the media. So I think he felt that his duty was to basically big everything up, and I understand where that comes from. I think
he was right for the time. You know,
absolutely.
The time that he was working, that was entirely appropriate, and then you move on. I mean, I suppose when things have a bit more confidence, you know, if there's not much going on, you have to say it's all great. But when there's a much broader span of gay books and plays and shows, and
absolutely,
you know,
absolutely. I remember years ago, I was before I came to Time Out, I was freelancing for the gay press, and to be fair, Michael Mason, who was the guy that owned Capital Gay, which was a free paper, he would let me write pretty much anything. He never censored me in any way. And I remember interviewing a documentarian who made a film about Quentin Crisp, and at the time I was quite sort of you know, I was about 23, 24 maybe. And I found everything about Quentin Crisp really offensive, because he said so many negative things. I mean, he did say that, you know, AIDS was a fad, which is a pretty offensive thing to say. And that no homosexual would ever be happy because they wanted a great dark man and they couldn't find one because a great dark man had to be straight and all that kind of stuff. There's a lot of self-loathing, internalized homophobia going on. And because of that, I was quite critical of this film. And when I interviewed the director, he said to me, well, the sign of a healthy culture is that it can withstand criticism. And that really stayed in my head, that our the gay culture that I was part of didn't really take criticism very well. So I kind of knew that when I was going to take this line in my writing, that I was going to get into trouble with people. And sure enough, I did. I mean, you know, barely a week went by without somebody slamming me for something, and, you know, Burston in cheerleading slur in the Press Gazette and stuff like that, or angry letters to Time Out, often written in green ink. So, you know, they were different times now. And I think many people at the time thought that I was pushing too far, too fast. I think I was accused once of saying the unsayable, which I thought was quite revealing. So there were things you weren't allowed to say, you know. And because I was in the mainstream media, there was a sense of, oh, you're washing dirty gay linen in public. Whereas if I was writing for the gay press, I wouldn't be allowed to write those things at all. So what choice did I have, you know? It was quite a difficult balancing act. And I think there were times when I got it wrong. I mean, I think I assumed that we were out of the woods where the mainstream media was concerned long before we actually were. I still think we're not quite out of the woods today. I mean, the backlash at the moment is quite extraordinary. But I think for a time in the 90s, certainly from the mid-90s onwards, there was such a shift in the culture in terms of what our lives and our expectations of what kind of life we could lead as gay people had changed an awful lot from when I was a small child or a young person. And I think it was the right time to start critiquing. And I look back now and I see a lot of other books that have come out since that period by other writers. And I think, you know, it's great that they're writing this stuff. And it's really good that people are exploring the impact of internalized homophobia. But the narrative back then was that you grow up gay in a homophobic culture, you go to gay pride, and then everything's fabulous after that. Well, that's not true. How can you grow up in a homophobic culture and internalize that for the first 20 or more years of your life and not have it internal, you know, damage to yourself? Of course there's damage. Of course there's trauma. And I wrote about that at a time when people didn't want to hear about it. Nowadays, people write about it a lot more. There are books coming out about, you know, the velvet rage and, you know, gay shame and all this sort of stuff. And back then there weren't. So it ruffled a few feathers, the kind of things I was saying. But I stand by most of it. I mean, as I say, there were some things I said at the time in anger, or on a come down, perhaps. maybe I was a little bit too hard line about some things, but I think on the whole, I got it mostly right.
They were hard partying days at Time Out. And then the other great thing was everything wasn't immediately, you know, pre-internet, you know, your writing was sort of at the bottom of the budgie's cage at the end of the week, you know, so you weren't necessarily judged by something that you said 6 months, 2 years ago.
Yeah,
it was more free flowing.
I think both in life and in journalism, I'm glad that I had a life and a journalistic career pre-internet, because now everything comes back to haunt you. I mean, you know, people are being, you know, cancelled because of something they tweeted in 2009 that was at that time seen as perfectly, you know, not acceptable maybe, but maybe not as offensive as it's seen now, because we've changed a lot of attitudes now, and there is a lot of cancel culture and people being exposed for hypocrisy because they said such and such then, and now they're saying this. Well, if you were thinking and writing the same things now that you did 15 years ago, then why are you still alive? You're not growing or evolving. So I don't think people should be held to account for, you know, a silly tweet they may have posted 15 years ago. What matters to me is what they believe now and what they're doing now. I think you should judge people by their actions more than sometimes by their words. There's a strong obsession now with, you know, searching through somebody's back history online. Similarly with, you know, my partying days in the 90s were mostly pre-internet, and there aren't photographs of me, thank God. Actually, there was one photograph of me that was published in a gay magazine. I hosted a party at my house called Wig Stockwell.
I went to Wig Stockwell.
Yeah, you did. And I ended up going out partying in a sort of Daisy Duke shorts and a bra top. I didn't look great in that outfit, I have to say. And I was on ecstasy, and I was at the Fridge dancing on the stage. At the Fridge in those days, people used to dance actually on the stage after the shows. And I was photographed, and it appeared in Gay Times, that photograph. I'm rather glad it isn't on the internet.
My hair then was longer than it is now, and I'd kind of frizzed it up and tortured it and it was all over the place. And people came up to me and go, "I love your wig." And then when I said, "It's my hair," they'd go, "Oh!"
You were cheating.
I was cheating. Terrible, terrible cheat. Yes, it was a legendary party. So your first book, I think, was Queen's Country, wasn't it? Your non-fiction sort of travelogue.
No, my first book was a queer romance with Routledge.
Ah.
Some years before that, 95, and that came out of my MA, because for my MA, my dissertation, I wrote about Hollywood and homoeroticism and the denial of homosexuality. So I wrote about Top Gun and American Gigolo, and how those films sort of play what we now call gay baiting. They kind of play to a gay audience while denying that gay audience. And so quite academic. And then I put together an anthology of a collection of essays, which I co-edited with someone and got various writers to contribute to that. So that was my first publication. And then the same year, I published a collection of my own journalism to date, which was called What Are You Looking At? Quite an aggressive title on purpose. Then I wrote a small, thin biography of Mark Almond, who I'm a huge fan of. And then I wrote Queen's Country.
Right.
And Queen's Country was, I basically pitched another idea, or rather my agent pitched another idea. So I got an agent off the back of the first 3 books. And my agent pitched an idea which was going to be really more of the same, a kind of book of gay film criticism. And Andrew Willey at Little Brown came back saying, "I don't want this book, but I would like to talk to Paul about something else." So I went in to see him, and the idea was, there was a book by Edmund White called States of Desire, which was a book in which he traveled across the United States, exploring the gay community and sort of consolidating the idea of a gay community. And his idea was for me to write a British version, but because I was known as a polemicist and being quite controversial and all that sort of thing, he knew that it would be a bit more tongue-in-cheek. So I sort of borrowed a bit from Bill Bryson in terms of the tone, because I loved Bill Bryson's Notes from a Small Island. And so I went off in search of this mythical thing called the gay community, and of course struggled to find it, because there isn't one gay community. There are lots of different gay communities, and they're very, very diverse, and they may not always like each other or get on. So Queen's Country sort of set me off on that path. And then, because I was writing about characters and places, like I was interviewing real life people and talking about their lives. And there were different themes in each chapter of the book. So there was, in Belfast, I talked about religion, because it obviously begs the question. I wrote about sort of life in rural Derbyshire, called A Cottage in the Country, with a little pun on cottaging. But mainly it was about characters and places. And Andrew read it and loved it, and then said, "I think you should write a novel next." And I'd written fiction for a long time before then, but only for my own entertainment. I mean, right from when I was very young, I used to write these books called The Adventures of Jim. And my friend Caroline Bryant, she was called then. She's now called Caroline McCartan, and she would do the illustrations. This is when I was in junior school. But I never wrote fiction professionally. I was quite nervous about that. But with Andrew's encouragement, I wrote a book called Shameless, and that was my first novel. And that was a kind of, the brief for that again from him was, "I want you to write a gay Bridget Jones." It was the time of Bridget Jones and all those, what became known as chick lit. And he wanted me to write about a gay singleton. And I just moved into my flat in Oval, and my neighbor across the hall was a guy called Martin. And he had come home one day, and his boyfriend of many years had just moved out without any explanation. And I got friendly with Martin, and he said, "Oh, you should use my story for your book." And he insisted I call the character Martin, which I did. So the book was basically this gay man who's been in a comfortable domestic relationship, suddenly thrown back out onto the gay dating scene, clubs and bars and saunas and all the rest of it. So he's a kind of innocent abroad in a way. And so it's a kind of satire about what gay London was like back then, which of course I was documenting in Time Out anyway. So I knew that world really well. But what I did is I used to get annoyed at some of the Bridget Jones. I mean, not so much the book a little bit, but the film in particular, because it referred to gay men as puffs, as if that was an acceptable term. And also in the books, and also in many of the other books that came up around that time in that sort of chick lit genre, there was always the gay best friend who had no sex life of their own, and it made me so cross. So I kind of reversed the roles, and Martin has a best friend called Caroline who behaves outrageously in the way that gay men that I knew behaved outrageously. And many of the women that hung out with gay men I knew behaved outrageously. And Martin is quite a kind of old-fashioned boy looking for an old-fashioned boy to settle down with. So I kind of had fun being, reversing the roles and the expectations for the reader. It was full of some quite explicit scenes, which when my mum read it, she was like, "Oh, I really enjoyed your book, but that scene with the amputee, oh, totally fictional, totally fictional. Happening in Shameless was totally fictional. This is a complete lie. Everything that happened in Shameless happened either to me or to someone I know." So when I got those inevitable reviews on Amazon saying this book doesn't represent me, I thought, well, it's not meant to. It's not meant to. That's not my role. My role is to tell a story. These characters are about themselves, and they're real, and they're based on real people, all of them, or they're composites of real people. So I don't buy that criticism, the idea that people from minority communities, if they write a book, they have to represent everyone in that community. That's a ludicrous expectation to place on an author. You should be free to write about whoever you want and what kind of characters you want. But again, it's that hangover of that gay is good thing, from the journalism angle. It's that hangover that you have to write gay characters who behave well. When Queer as Folk was first screened, the head of Stonewall at the time went on to write a reply to condemn it, because Nathan, the young man in the beginning, goes out looking for sexual experiences on Canal Street. Nobody preys on him. Nobody goes in. Nobody's hanging around school gates preying on him. He's a self-determined young man of 16, which is the age of consent that it is for heterosexuals and should have been for us at the time, but it wasn't. It was 18 at that time for gay men. He has autonomy. He has sexual autonomy. What's wrong with that? And I found it bizarre. So I kind of leapt to the defense of Queer as Folk in Time Out. And through that, I became friends with Russell T Davies, who's been very supportive of me ever since. But I do think that there's still that, we still have that to some extent, there's this expectation that if you have a voice, you must use it to represent all people in your community. And I just don't think that's reasonable.
Yeah, it's too much to put on you. Did you have a 2-book deal or a 3-book deal or anything like that at this stage?
I was always on single book deals, always. I did four novels with Little Brown, not with Andrew, because by the time Shameless was finished, because I took a long time researching it, which meant going out clubbing and experimenting with all the things that Martin experimented with. And so one day a friend of mine said, "I think you've done enough research now, Paul. Maybe you should just write this book, But I did 3 more novels with them, and then I got dropped unexpectedly. I wasn't expecting that, and it threw me into a free fall. I did a book called The Gay Divorcee in 2009, and before it came out in trade paperback, and before the main paperback had even been released. So the early sales figures for a trade paperback are not what you'd expect for the main paperback. They dropped me along with loads of other people, but it threw me into a tailspin. And my agent at the time wanted me to change my name and all this sort of thing. And I had to sort of reinvent myself a little bit, really. To be honest, I had kind of, I was writing what were classed as sort of gay rom-coms, although to me they were kind of satires. To me, they were social satires, and there was comedy in them, but there was also darkness in them. I mean, people died in those books. There were queer bashings, there were murders. So I'd always read crime fiction. It was always a genre that I was very interested in. So it just seemed a natural thing for me to go from writing the books I was writing to writing more crimey novels. But it took me a while to sort of get my confidence back. So there was a long gap from 2009 was The Gay Divorcee, and then 2017 was The Black Path. So that was 8 years between books, which is a long time. I did edit some short story collections in between. So I did get my hand in, but my confidence in myself as a novelist was a bit shaken. So it took me a while.
Well, in between came Polari, of course, which is a whole incredible thing that you've built there. And I always took it that the Polari salon came about because of these books that you had written, and as you say, they're social satires, they're commercial fiction, they're sparkling. There's no reason for them not to get a wide readership. and yet you weren't being treated like the chick lit authors. You weren't being treated in the same way. You were like being crammed in a niche. Is that
Yes,
how
I
you
mean,
felt?
I mean, absolutely. I mean, 2007, I put out my third novel, which was called Lovers and Losers, which in many ways was a more mature novel than the previous ones. It was the first novel in which I looked back at the AIDS crisis, because I'd avoided that in my fiction because it was too painful, and there was more of a depth to it, I think, than the previous two maybe. And I didn't get invited to a single event to promote that book. It came out I think in May, so I'd missed February, which is LGBT History Month, so libraries get you in during that period, and there was no opportunities, or virtually no opportunities, to promote it. So I thought, I can either sit here and complain, or I can just get off my backside and do something. So I'm being an activist, I kick doors down, I make things happen. I set up this little salon, and it started really small. I remember you came to some of the early ones at the Green Carnation. It was tiny. So that was in November 2007 it launched. But it grew really quickly, and we outgrew 2 venues. And then by 2009, we were at the South Bank Centre, where we were for many years. And now we're at the British Library. So it's sort of gone from strength to strength, and it's got bigger over the years. We've also been touring since 2014. So for the last 7 years, we've been traveling. So no, more than 7 years. The last 9 years, we've been traveling around the country, showcasing emerging and established LGBT plus writers. So it's been a real journey, and one I've enjoyed hugely. And the amount of support we get now is just fantastic. And now I'm getting the invitations to those book events, because Polari has sort of lifted me up at the same time. It's made people more aware of me as a writer, so it's sort of benefited me as well. But I mean, I do take it very seriously that once you've created a platform, you have a responsibility to use it to pull up other people. I'm not someone who believes in kicking the ladder down behind you. I think you should pull up other people. And so I've used Polari for the last, well, certainly since 2009, when we had a proper showcase and a budget. I've used it to lift up other writers and to encourage emerging writers, whether they're younger or older, because some people start writing when they get older, but certainly new writers. I think that's a real responsibility that I have now, is to help showcase them, which is why we launched the Polari First Book Prize, which you've been involved with since 2011 when we launched it. That was because I was seeing so many people coming to Polari, sometimes reading at Polari or just talking to me after an event, who had self-published. And they'd self-published not because they weren't good enough to get published, but because the opportunities to get published are so small, or they're so few. And self-publishing gave authors the means of production. And if your books are getting turned down because we've already got a gay book this year, which is something people used to say to me often, I hear that often, back in the day, or the book is too gay, we've got another gay book, blah, blah, blah. Then people self-published. In fact, the first winner of the Polari First Book Prize was a self-published book, James Maker's memoir. So I think that's something I take very seriously, that duty. I think it's a big responsibility, and I enjoy it hugely, but it's a lot of work, a lot of unpaid work. But it's something that I believe in very passionately, that I should use my platform to support other writers in the same way that when I was young, there were lots of other writers who helped and supported and encouraged me. And I owe them a huge debt. Sadly, most of them aren't here now, but they helped me a lot, so it's paying it forward time, I guess.
It also helped you create or bring out of yourself this extraordinary host persona, the MC of Polari, who is never knowingly underdressed, rarely under made up, often sports wings or a top hat.
I was debating whether I should appear as him today, but I thought, no, I'll keep him in the closet for today.
Yeah, you can put him on and take him off, but he's quite something to behold, isn't he? The MC when he gets going.
That only came about because I was so nervous going on stage. I'd taken part in a couple of events just prior to launching Polari, I think the year before, and I was doing readings for my book at an event in Manchester, at a library in Manchester. and I had such stage fright. I was so nervous, and I discovered that if I went on stage dressed as a sort of persona, that I felt far more comfortable. So I started off with just wearing suits, because suits do give you confidence. There's no question. I mean, when I wear a suit jacket, I feel a different person. It gives you a shape. It gives you a silhouette that looks good, and so on. And then it sort of went from there, really, and it became more and more elaborate and playful. And I was a drama student, so I had been messing about with costumes since I was quite young, and I'm a huge Bowie fan, so that kind of makes sense that you create a persona, because that's what Bowie did repeatedly in his career. And he created Ziggy Stardust because he didn't have the confidence to go on stage as David Bowie. So I kind of took it from the master that I would create this sort of persona who was the MC of Polari, and that was somebody that I could hide behind, and it gave me more confidence. I mean, I think nowadays I'm more comfortable on stage anyway, so I don't always dress as extravagantly perhaps as I used to. I certainly haven't worn those ISIS wings for many years. There was a period where I was going more and more elaborate with the ISIS wings and the costuming, and actually forgetting about the content of what I was going to say. But I got a bit carried away for a while. But now it's sort of, I think I've reached a sort of happy medium now, where there is an element of theatricality to it, because Polari is really a cabaret. When people who haven't been to it before ask me to explain what it is, and I say literary salon, they think it's going to be sort of something very serious and dry and bookish, in the way that lots of bookish events can be, But to me, it's a cabaret in which the performers happen to be writers. So there's still an element of showmanship about it, for sure, definitely. But I think that's called for, and it kind of it kind of creates an energy in the room if you come on stage and you're kind of looking like an MC, and it kind of sets the tone for the evening, I think, and it gives people a sense of what to expect, that there's going to be something quite theatrical going on. So even though there may be there's always a mixture of spoken word poets, spoken word performers, authors, even live music. So it's a very, very varied bill at any one event, but the common theme that runs through them is diversity, both in terms of the demographics of the people that are on the stage, and also in terms of the genres. So I wouldn't showcase an evening where all the authors it was all poets or all novelists. I always vary it. So it's a variety show, cabaret. That's how I think of it as a producer. I never used to think of myself as a producer. I thought of myself as an MC and host. And it was only when I went to the Arts Council, or rather I actually was given a message by somebody who's been for a meeting with them, and was told they wanted me to approach them. And I went in for a meeting in 2014, and they were really keen to support Polari in doing something. And I said, well, I'd like to go on a tour. So that was the first tour, which was 8 destinations. The most recent tour was 25 destinations. So it's grown each year. And it was only when I had to do the application that I realized that I had to basically factor in the fact that I was a producer, and that I should get a producer's fee. Because before, I just thought of myself as the host, even though I did all of the sourcing the light, creating the bill, finding the people, getting hold of photographs, bios, etc., doing all the work of a producer basically, and a promoter, and also hosting. So it's a lot of work that I wasn't really being paid for. And it's only since we've been touring that I actually get paid for all that work, because it does take a lot of time to do all of that, obviously, as well as sourcing, booking hotels and train tickets and all the rest of it that you need to do when you're touring. It's a lot of work. So nowadays I sort of have with Polari, I'm a kind of producer stroke MC.
Can you share a few magic moments, some highlights over the last years of Polari? Favorite performers? Or
they've been so many. I mean, I tend to think of our prize winners often, because we've had people who maybe weren't getting the recognition that they deserved and now are getting it, and that's partly through what Polari's offered them. Then we have people like Joelle Taylor, who won the Polari Prize this last year, who won the T.S. Eliot Prize as well. But she's been performing at Polari for a while, a bit like me. Joelle was somebody who wasn't getting publishing deals, wasn't getting a platform, so she created her own, and she's now one of the finest spoken word poets we have. I mean, she's amazing, and working with her is always a great pleasure. Working with V.G. Lee, working with Karen MacLeod. In the early days, we had David McAlmont performing for us, which is always a big thrill. We had Will Self came and read at the Green Carnation. We've had such a wide variety of people, and sometimes we have visiting authors who happen to be in the country, so we'll put them on the bill if they're around. But we've had such a diverse range, and I always feel a bit bad if I single out individual people, because it implies that the others didn't make much of an impact on me, whereas they did. But you know, we've been doing this for 15 years now. I've been doing this for 15 years, and coming up to 16 years this year. And there've been so many events and so many people. I tend to think of individual shows. I mean, our first ever show north of Watford was at Huddersfield Lit Fest in 2014. And Michelle Hodgson, who's the festival director there, approached me about that. And we had V.G. Lee, Adam Lowe, Keith Jarrett, the poet. A very, very mixed. I tend to think in terms of moments. And there have been some incredible moments at Polari where somebody has really shone. And I've seen them. I mean, recently we did an event at Heaven, Polari in Heaven, and Sophia Blackwell, who I've known since the early days. She's been performing with us for 10 years at least. She just upped her game, because we were at Heaven. There's big tech involved. There's a big diamond screen, and you can show film and interact with it. And she really rose to the occasion, and she took her performance to a whole new level. And that was such a great moment. Similarly, back at the South Bank Centre in the mid sort of 2015 maybe, Dirie Osman won the Polari Prize that year and was so surprised and shocked. And he just jumped out of the seat and held his arms up in the air. And Chris, who used to photograph the events for us, Christina Fitzgerald Morris, took an amazing photograph of Dirie just leaping for joy in the audience. And it was an amazing moment for him collecting the prize that year, which was presented by Mari Hanna, the previous year's winner. And it's just a very exciting. I love seeing those moments when writers really come into their own as performers, because not all writers are natural performers. Many of us are very, very shy and retiring at times, you know, and we spend half of our life on our computers in isolation creating these stories, and then the other half going out and promoting our books. And not everyone is comfortable doing that. Some people are very, very self-conscious and shy, and seeing people gradually lose that shyness and become more comfortable on stage is a great joy for me to witness that. I love witnessing that. And I've witnessed that many times over the years. And it's something that still brings me. I mean, there's a guy in Manchester who we do regular events in Manchester. And I had a guy there called Will Belshaw, who basically needed he wanted to get involved in Polari in some way. So I had him come and do the door for me, take tickets and tick people's names off. And then he mentioned that he was writing some poetry, and I read something. I thought it was really good and put him on. And the first time he read, he was good, but he was a bit self-conscious. And we just recently had him on again at Huddersfield Lit Fest, and he was fantastic. And it was so great to see somebody who's in their 20s, maybe hadn't been writing for a long time, and has just come on so rapidly by being part of what we're doing because Polari it feels like a kind of family, you know. It feels like a family. It's a very supportive environment. I've been to so many book events where you come on stage and the audience is sat there with their arms folded, like, come on and impress me. And I try and create the atmosphere by the way I dress and the way I talk to the audience, to try and make people more relaxed, so that when people come on stage, the audience is already warm and that they're responsive and supportive. And that's the atmosphere that people get when they come to Polari. I think most of the writers I've worked with would say that performing for us is a very, very safe, warm environment. It's very friendly, and there's a social aspect to it as well. People mingle and chat. So it isn't as intimidating, perhaps. And maybe that's partly what the function of my role as MC, the persona, is there for. It's to kind of warm that up and create that expectation so that people are warm. I don't want the atmosphere to be one of like, oh, come on, then impress me. That's awful, you know.
It's always a great audience. They're always very warmly supportive, but I do think it's partly the way you structure things, that nobody gets too long. Even the superstars don't get, you know, you can talk as long as you like. And I know that in the past there have been some people, and we won't name names, but some people have slightly abused that. I know you've kind of said, look, it's 10 minutes and then you're off.
It's 15 really, usually 15 to 20, 15 to 20 maybe. And there have been people that I've said to them, leave, you know, it's an old showbiz, you know, message, which is, you know, leave them wanting more. Don't go on, because the reality is most people listening to somebody read aloud to you, most people's attention span will last for about 15 minutes. After that, they switch off. They just switch off, and there's no point in carrying on and so bludgeoning them with more and more and more. And I've seen it happen. I've seen people at Polari have the audience in the grip of their hand and then lose them by just saying, and now for my third extract, I'm going to read this. And the audience, and you can see the audience go from leaning forward to leaning back in there. I can see the body language. I witness it from the side. I stand on the sidelines and watch, and you can see the body language when that happens. I always tell people, please don't do that, because you won't get as good a result. You won't promote your books as well as if you did it the other way. It's much better to leave them wanting more. And I know from experience that, you know, if you go on too long, you have to be a really amazing performer to keep people's attention going for that long. And not many of us are up to that. Not many of us are up to that. You know, it's not a one-person show. It's an ensemble, and everyone has their moment. But if you go on for too long, then it also means that some other people maybe have to cut their set in order to, you know, there is a time limit on the event as well. So if somebody goes on for double the time they were asked to, somebody else ends up having to cut their set in order to make up for it, so we don't run on too late. So that can be a problem, and there've been a few of those over the years, definitely.
And then there's the people who want to be at the top of the bill, and you have to say, no, somebody else is at the top of the bill. And
well, I mean, you know, when it started, there was always, when it began, it was like one or two readers in an event. When it was back in the early days, once we got to South Bank in 2009, it became 4 or 5. So there'd be 3 in the first half and 2 in the second half. Obviously, you're going to get a headline name who's going to bring in an audience, because you've got to get an audience of about 150 people. So you need a name to get those people in. And obviously that person's going to be at the head of the bill. But in terms of the others, it isn't necessarily in terms of how famous they are. It's in terms of what they're going to read, because I have to create an atmosphere.
What
and
the
I know
flow
it's going to be an
is.
emotional journey and a flow. Exactly. I don't want there to be, you know, 2 gritty, hard-hitting acts together, one after the other. I want there to be a change in mood. And I also want, for the most part, for the audience to leave on a high, or at least to go into the interval on a high. So I kind of, you know, work out where the comedic elements are going to fit in. And if there is something that's much harder hitting, then I may not put them at the end of the act. I may put them on just before. So they may be the headline name, but there'll be someone on after them. At Heaven, because we always have a musical element at Heaven. I've worked with Joelle quite a bit over the last couple of years, and she did her first performance of canto and other poems at Heaven, Polari in Heaven. And I saw after she finished performing that the audience needed a break, because there was people crying, and there's no way you can go on after that. You need to have the break then. So Joelle goes on in the first half before the interval, even though she's now probably the best known person on the bill, and she hasn't got an ego about that. She understands what I'm doing. She doesn't get precious about that. And also because we tend to end with live music, and that means that there's a certain atmosphere that people are expecting to leave Polari in Heaven in a certain mood, and that means that the running order has to fit that journey, you know, and that's very important to me. I think because my background was in theatre, because I did drama at university and for my MA as well. And I was involved in some fringe productions at the start of my career. I put a few plays on, and I worked as a director. And so I have a really strong sense of the shape of an evening and how it should go. So even though it's a cabaret, it's also one piece with an emotional journey. And that's something I also take very seriously. Trying to balance all of those things, the things I'm talking about now, and also the things I was discussing earlier, which is to do with diversity, is quite a challenge, because you're trying to make sure that the bill is as varied as possible. You've got as varied a group of people as possible, as varied a group of writers in terms of what they're writing and their style of writing and their genre. And you're trying to create a sort of, a journey in one evening. It's a lot to put on, and I don't always pull it off. There've been events that weren't as successful in all those respects than others, and that's inevitable, I guess. But it's what I aspire to each time. That's the goal I set myself, is for it to do all of those things. And I can't always make that happen, but when I can, I'm happy.
It's not dissimilar to editing a section at Time Out week after week after week after week.
That's
you've
true.
got to pick, select, juxtapose. It's a similar kind of skill set. So I just wanted to ask you about your memoir, which is forthcoming. That's out in a couple of months. Big buzz already building about that. Can you just you'll be rushed off your feet, I'm sure. Can you just tell me a little bit about the scope of the memoir? Is it Paul Burston, the early years, or career up until now? What does it cover?
It covers my whole life, from my birth to now, or to last year anyway. And it's themed. It's called We Can Be Heroes, obviously because of David Bowie, and also because the title has so many different resonances for me. Because when I was a young child, we, meaning people like me, were never the heroes. We were always the villains, or the character to laugh at. And in fiction, I struggle to find people like me. I mean, Gay's the Word bookshop in London, which is the LGBT bookstore in London, they regularly have customers come in and say, I want books about people like me. And nowadays you can find those books. They're being written. There are books being written for younger people. Heartstopper, which has recently been televised, was on our shortlist for the Polari Prize some years ago. So I'm aware of those books. When I was a kid, those books weren't there. So it was a very lonely path to try and find people like me in books. So the heroes refers to that. It also refers to the fact that I was an AIDS activist, and whenever I share pictures from ACT UP on social media, people always say, oh, you were such heroes. And I never felt like a hero. I was a kid who was bullied from a very young age. I was a survivor of abuse, and I was very, very frightened, very easily frightened. I would freeze and people would hit me and I wouldn't fight back. And I was called a coward and all those things. And I felt like a coward. But when AIDS came along, the impact was so huge and there was nothing I could do. I was cornered, and I could either go down or come out fighting. So I came out fighting. But that was the first time in my life that I can remember being a fighter. And the book is about that journey, really, from being this sort of silenced child who was covered in shame, to do with being gay, to do with being abused and bullied and all those things, to go from that person to being the man I am now, who is somebody who refuses to be silenced, because ACT UP's slogan was silence equals death. And I don't intend dying just yet. So the book is that journey. And it covers my family life, my early life. It covers my career as a writer and the various obstacles that have been put in the way, and the various things various challenges I've had to face. I've nearly died twice, once when I was 18, once when I was 38. And I've also survived 2 pandemics. So all of these things sort of structure the book, and it sort of ends. It opens with me. It opens with me outside heaven at the age of 19, terrified to go in, absolutely terrified. Never been to a gay bar, never been to a gay club, didn't know anyone. I think I told 2 people that I was gay at that point. But I went to heaven on my own on a Saturday night, the biggest, scariest gay club in London. I was too scared to go in. and it ends with me on stage at Heaven, presenting Play in Heaven on World AIDS Day. So it kind of has a nice, it fits together nicely. When I delivered it to my agent, which was literally 2 years ago, it was Easter 2 years ago, Easter 2021, and he was so confident and thrilled and excited about it that he actually went on Twitter and said, "This amazing book by Paul Burston, I can't wait to go on submission. It's going to get snapped up so quickly." It took forever to find a publisher. It got turned down by so many people. They didn't say it's too gay, because they wouldn't say that now. They say we have something similar. Now, unless somebody has lived my life, I don't believe they had something similar for 1 second. What they meant was they had another book by a gay person or another gay memoir, because there can only ever be one, you know. This absurdity that we're still facing this still to this day, this absurd notion that there's only room for one, which is ridiculous. So it took a long time to find a publisher, but when the letter of interest came from Vic at Amazon, Little A, the publishing imprint of Amazon, and when Vic Haslam sent the email expressing interest, I read the email and said to my agent, "I don't care what the money is, I want this person to edit my book," because she really got it. Not just the gay journey, but the broader journey, the fact that it's also about class. I mean, you and I are both people who came from ordinary backgrounds, went to university, did English, got into journalism, publishing, writing. Nowadays, that's much harder for people from our backgrounds, because most of those opportunities are in London. It's hugely expensive to move to London now. So unless you've got wealthy parents able to help you, it's much harder for you to get a foot in the door. And I have a real issue with that, because I think publishing is becoming really, really rarefied. And then that means that the people making those decisions are coming from that one social strata. And so working class is seen as almost a fetish. It's almost fetishized. You know, it's become othered, because people from those backgrounds aren't there. My first few publicists in my career in the 90s were all from similar backgrounds to me. My first few editors were all from backgrounds like me. Now they're not, on the whole. And Vic is, and she got the book. She got what that journey meant. You know, how I needed to escape where I was growing up, because I knew I was gay, and I didn't think at that time that I could survive as a gay person in that town. The only gay person I knew of was a friend of my stepdad, who used to touch my legs in a really inappropriate way when I was a teenager, who committed suicide. So that was the only image I had of what being gay in South Wales at that time was, in 1984, 1985. So I had to escape and reinvent myself and become a new, you know, come out and all of that. And I couldn't have done it there. Maybe I could do it there now, but I couldn't have done it there then. So I had to come to London and sort of start a whole new life. And I don't feel that that opportunity is there for people now. I think it's much harder for people to do that now. So in some ways, the book is quite nostalgic, really, for a time when you could do that. And that was the message I got from Bowie. That was the big message I got from Bowie was, you know, you don't have to be David Jones from the suburbs. You can be David Bowie, rock star. You know, it's a really powerful message. You can be Ziggy Stardust, alien messiah. You can be, you know, all these, the Thin White Duke. You can be all these different people. And that's a really powerful message, I think. I think the idea of reinvention and the idea that you can not only reinvent yourself, but you can reinvent yourself multiple times. And there's a great quote from him where he talked later in life about finding solace and happiness, and that was about learning to live with all of your past selves and how to accommodate them into your persona. And when I created Polari, I didn't realize this at the time, but I look back now and I realized that I was doing exactly that. I was taking the drama student, the writer, the activist, and putting them all into this one event, because Polari for me is activism. You know, creating a platform for LGBTQ voices is activism. Creating a prize of book prizes that celebrate those voices is activism. It's making a statement. It's changing the culture. So I still regard myself as an activist, even though I'm not out getting arrested on demonstrations all the time like I used to when I was 20. You know, I put in my years as a street activist, and they really took their toll. I was really burnt out by the end of it. But they did shape me, and they did make me the person I am, and they did shape how I approach things. But I do think that all those past selves, all my past selves, exist within me now, and they all inform what I do now.
Well, I can't wait to read it, and in fact, I hope you'll come back on when it's been published and talk about
I'd
it
love to.
again.
I'd love to. Yeah, definitely.
But just to wind up, and thank you hugely for an enlightening conversation. I'm going to ask you my 3 questions that I'm asking everybody who comes on. So the first one is, do you have a favourite artwork? You've certainly got one just over your shoulder, but I don't know whether it's your favourite or not.
I can't. I love this painting. Trademark painted me 10 years ago and made me look really beautiful, but I can't.
Are you able to tilt back a little bit so that we can see it? I know this portrait very well.
There you go.
It's got the Bowie slash. And what I love about this, Paul, is it has really captured something of you. It has got defiance in it, but it's also got wariness and vulnerability. You know, like,
I agree.
Ready to fight. I don't want to fight. I'll fight if you make me. You know, I love the way it's captured something about you.
That is very, very insightful. I actually say that in the book when I first saw it, because Mark works on photographs. You do a photo shoot with him, and he chooses a photograph. You agree it, and then he does the painting. And when I saw the photograph he chose, and I thought, God, he's really captured something there. He really captured something. And when I saw the painting for the first time, it was actually at a gallery. I went to see it at a gallery in an exhibition with my parents. My parents came and my sister came, and I saw it, and I felt so emotional when I saw it, because I thought, God, he's really captured the vulnerability that I have. Because people meet me. I mean, I still have this today. I had an email recently from somebody saying, well, when I met you in the 90s, you were so frightening. I probably was. I was doing quite a lot of pharmaceuticals back in those days. But there is a vulnerability there, yeah, for sure. But I can't call that my favorite painting or my favorite artwork. But I was recently, just a few days ago, at an opening of an exhibition. And I'm going to say this, because it is art. I'm going to say that this is my favorite artwork. Yes. Because I do think that is a work of art, that painting. I think it's that photograph and art. I think it's an extraordinary statement. It was at the time, I think, one of the most expensive album covers ever produced. Very much on purpose, because Bowie's manager, Tony DeFries, knew that if the record company spent lots of money on the sleeve of the record, they would then spend money trying to recoup it in marketing. So I think at the time I'm right in saying it was the most expensive album cover produced. But I think it still resonates today. There's something about that album, that image of Bowie with his eyes closed, with that lightning bolt, and that little gel here, that sort of teardrop almost. Yeah. I think it still resonates. And I think the fact that, you know, it's 50 years now, it's 50 years since Aladdin Sane came out. And when I was a young teenager, listening to that album saved my life. That album, there's a song on it called Time, which after he'd recorded it and released it, he then, being Bowie, sort of made this comment like, I was so shocked that I'd written a gay song. Of course he knew he was writing a gay song. And to me, as a 14-year-old, deeply closeted and deeply traumatized and feeling pretty suicidal, actually, a lot of the time. I even attempted once to kill myself when I was 14. When I heard that, it was like a lifeline, that the fact that there's somebody singing about a gay or queer or whatever existence beyond the small town in which I live. That to me was a really powerful, life-saving message. And the fact that this album is now 50 years old, and I'm still seeing young people wearing T-shirts with this image on the cover of them, or doing makeup. You know, I mean, Lady Gaga recently did something very similar. I think it still resonates today. I'm hosting an event at South Bank actually to celebrate 50 years of it, and we're talking about Aladdin Sane's queer legacies. And I do think that it has an enormous legacy. I think it's still impactful. And I think what Duffy did, the photographer, with that image is extraordinary. I mean, it was taken, I think he did 20 or maybe 30 shots of Bowie at the time, and then chose the one, and then, you know, created all the effects to make it look so alien and otherworldly. But it's really striking. It's the first image I have in my head, because I was 14 in 79, and the first Bowie album I remember at the time of it coming out was Lodger. and the Boys Keep Swinging video, where he performs as the three backing singers in drag,
Yes,
which sent such a shiver of recognition through me.
Yeah,
so, but
extraordinary.
I was a Beck fan. I went and discovered his backlist, you know, in 1979. But I remembered that image as a kid, because people would walk around school with that album underneath their arm. You know, people used to carry their albums around, their LPs, to show who they were. It was very tribal back then, wasn't it? And that image had always stayed in my head. I remembered that album cover vividly, long before I'd even heard the music. I knew that album cover. I knew that image. It spoke to me. It said something to me from the time I was very young. I would have been 8 when that came out. You know, 7 or 8 when Aladdin Sane was released. I was far too young to appreciate the music. I do remember hearing Jean Genie on the radio when I was 7 or 8, because it's such a, you know, Bowie was very good at writing for children. He often wrote songs. He did. I mean, you know, he wrote songs. There's a song called Kooks on Hunky Dory, and he often wrote for and The Prettiest Star on that on Aladdin Sane. They're quite simple, you know, almost novelty songs in a way. And he had written those songs in the past, like the Laughing Gnome and all the early records he did for Decca. But he still retained that childlike quality, I think, even when he was being this outrageous alien from Mars. There was this childlike quality about him. And Jean Genie is quite a kind of sing-along song that a young person can just sing without knowing what it's about. I mean, I had no idea that Jean Genie was a pun on Jean Genet. How would I know that? When I discovered that, of course, I went straight away to go and look at, you know, Jean Genet and read Jean Genet, and then I was traumatized all over again, because that was really depressing. But I love Jean Genet.
Bowie opened so many doors, didn't he? His references were so huge that you could just dive into his world. But I want to get on to my second question.
Yeah.
Which is, do you have a book of shame? That is a book that you should have read, you've pretended to have read maybe, but you haven't got round to.
I thought about this. I think the only one I can honestly say that of is Ulysses, because when I was at school doing A-level English, it wasn't a set text or anything. I would have read it, obviously, because I'd have had to, but it was a book that everyone was talking about. They discovered this amazing book, Ulysses, James Joyce. James Joyce is so wonderful. It's a landmark book, blah blah blah. And I tried and failed so many times to read Ulysses. I just couldn't get around the barrier in the language and the way it's written. It was just too difficult for me. I still find books that are written in that sort of stylistically challenging way quite difficult and quite challenging still to this day. But Ulysses was the one I used to pretend that I'd read, because all the cool kids had read it. And then, of course, when Kate Bush released The Sensual World back in the late 80s, and the title track is about Molly Bloom, one could pretend that you'd read Ulysses by just listening to Kate Bush. So that's what I did. I listened to Kate Bush instead. That was my education.
This is very interesting.
And Ulysses.
This is very interesting, because so far we've had 2 votes for Henry James, and we've had 2 votes for Ulysses. So, you know, there might be a trend developing. My final question to you is, has anybody ever said anything truly weird or bizarre or unhelpful about your work? In terms of a review or feedback or anything like that?
I mean, the one thing I get, which I mentioned already, is that I get that challenging comments maybe on Amazon from gay readers saying this book doesn't represent me, and I find that frustrating because it's not claiming to represent you. The strangest one I've ever had was when I was at a party and somebody said, you write those scandalous books, don't you? And I thought, are they scandalous? I mean, that's a strange word to use. I mean, I don't find them particularly scandalous. I mean, if there were, and there are many, many books about heterosexual characters behaving badly, God knows. There are people who go around murdering people. And I was writing these sort of comedies about gay men being a bit self-destructive and a bit compulsive and having not very good sex and taking drugs. I don't find that scandalous. I think that's just because of the homosexuality that it's somehow seen as scandalous. So I guess that's the one that really sticks in my head, because it just seems to come from such a kind of heterosexist, narrow-minded point of view.
I'm also slightly reminded of a time that we were both at a party together. And I think it was at the Cadogan Hotel, and there was an Oscar Wilde theme or something. And do you remember this? Somebody came up and said, "You're Paul Burston, aren't you?" And then what was their line? "Not as evil as you used to be," or something like that. It was,
yeah.
And then they walked off.
I don't think that was a review of my books. I think that was a review of my person.
Yeah. And we both just looked at each other, like, kind of, what happened there?
Yeah, that was kind of gobsmacking. I think that was somebody who probably took great umbrage at a review I wrote 20 years previously in Time Out of something that they were maybe associated with, or a friend of somebody that they were associated with.
That you've long forgotten. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you write so many reviews. You know this as a journalist yourself. You write so many reviews over the years. You don't always remember them. And, because I was writing in such a broad range of, subjects, so whether it was books or theatre or restaurants or reviewing bars or clubs or whatever, it could have been any one of a number of things that this person took great umbrage at me having written about. Or maybe it was a more general comment about, the fact that I was this very, provocateur back then, and maybe it was just a general comment on that.
We shall never know. We shall never know.
He's entitled
just
to
one
that
of
view,
those.
of course. He's perfectly entitled to that view. It just was very funny. You're right. I'd forgotten about it, but it was very, very funny. I think somebody else was. I think I just met someone else for the first time, a young chap, and we were chatting for a while, and we got on really well. And he introduced me to this guy, and so this is Paul. I just met Paul. He's really lovely. And then the guy was like, "No, he's not," which is really funny.
Well, I'll have to wrap up there, but thanks. That's been a very entertaining conversation, and indeed trip down memory lane. So all the best for the memoir when it comes out. Like I said, I'd love to have you back to talk about that. And all it remains for me to say is thank you very much, Paul.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me, Suzi.
And thank you for everyone listening to this. I hope you've enjoyed this conversation between me and Paul. We're old pals, and I hope we've invited you into our world. If you did enjoy this, then please make sure to subscribe and like, and I'll see you next time in the book bag with a new tote bag and a new interviewee. Until next time, thanks.